Lord Mayor of Dublin, President, distinguished guests, it's my pleasure to welcome you to UCD and to our UCD Bloomsday event. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce both of our speakers to you. It's been a day of celebration at UCD as we honour our most famous alumnus, James Joyce. We started the day with a conferment ceremony where we honoured the holders of the Ireland Chair of Poetry, as well as Gary Trudeau. And we finished the ceremony with a presentation to Seamus Heaney of the Ulysses Medal. And so this event will round off our day of celebration. It's called The Painter and the Critic. The painting in question is the very wonderful commission of James Joyce, commissioned by UCD Foundation. The donor is Deirdre and Thomas Lynch, who wanted to help establish Bloomsday for UCD. Robert Ballagh, who needs no introduction, is famous and much loved for his hyper-realistic renderings of distinguished historical and literary figures in Ireland. Professor Declan Kiberd is the chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at UCD. One of his most famous Joyce books is Ulysses and Us, his most recent, The Art of Everyday Living. And so I'm going to, first of all, introduce you to Professor Declan Kiberd, who is going to introduce the painting. Before I do so, could I ask you, please, if you would turn your mobile phones to silent or mute. And at the end of our conversation, which will last some 45 minutes, we're going to give you, the guests, the opportunity of questions of both of our speakers. So, without further ado, could I welcome, please, Professor Declan Kiberd.
Dear President, Lord Mayor, colleagues, dear Robert and his family, I'm awfully honoured to do this, but of course I am only a literary critic. I haven't a clue what painting is about, so I feel like an atheist at a Eucharistic Congress. But that's okay, that's probably why he asked me. Not only that, I notice, a bit like Brendan Behan's theories of execution, that if they were going to condemn me, they could shoot me also in my absence. We will discuss the painting initially in its absence as well, and therefore I can say anything I want. Joyce, of course, was painted before, once by a man called Patrick Toohey, who began talking eloquently about the artist's soul, and Joyce stopped him and said, "No, never mind my soul, Toohey, just make sure you get my tie right." Robert has come up with a very cunning solution to this artistic problem. Robert, who never talks about souls and has always attended to realistic detail, but he has responded to the joke in his own way by decking Joyce in a dotted red and white bow tie. The great man in the painting, to me, could be a holy clown, scornful of his most famous pages as he lets them blow away in the wind on Sandymount Strand. But there is also, and I'm giving a very personal response, a touch of the seaside vaudevillian about the way in which he's perched on his walking cane. All he lacks is, in fact, a David Norris straw boater. You know, he could be one of the revellers on Bloomsday if he had it, but instead he sports a full head of well-combed hair, something which for me is a distant memory. I think the cane also evokes memories of the Gaelic bards, the Fili, who carried a rod as a symbol of their Vatic powers, the ability to tap into the waters, the currents beneath the surface of the earth, below the layers of consciousness. It's interesting that the tide is out in the painting, perhaps because the waters of the subconscious have been rolled back. And I noticed that the folds in Joyce's suit, which is clearly a Louis Copeland suit, the folds in the suit extend the ripple effect, which is so beautifully done on the sand, the traces left by water on sand, just as the colours of the sky are reflected in the waters beneath. And of course, and it is a satiric touch, the man in the picture has his head in the clouds, and there are a lot of clouds, more than you'd see in any Paul Henry painting. But his feet, of course, are on the ground. and his gaze is steadfast. It is at once mournful and penetrating. And I think his mouth is the downturned mouth of a clown, but it's sad just as the bow tie is jaunty. And the two jeweled rings on the hand are the only signs of self-display in this rather austere figure. And they remind us, of course, as we were told once, that the hands that wrote Ulysses did a lot of other things as well. Now, Joyce has often been painted, like most artists, in terms of the head or the upper body. But here the portrait is of the bodily whole. A young idealist once went up to Joyce and put his hand on his heart and began talking about emotion. And Joyce rather savagely said, "No, young man, the seat of the affections is a lot lower down." Well, I think Robert's approach by giving the whole body is only fair when we think of Joyce as the man who created the epic of the entire human body. Like many of Robert's other great paintings, this one is informed partly by photographs of the subject, which I think brilliantly capture not just Joyce's facial expression, but the painting also captures the angle of his body, the angle adopted towards reality, the posture of someone who could be a seaside entertainer, but might also be a secret Jesuit at one and the same time. What I think the brilliance of the painting lies in is its use of the T shape to present something that is both a portrait and a landscape. The portrait is vertical, the landscape is horizontal. And the landscape is of Howth Hill as seen from the south side, with the Bailey Lighthouse over one shoulder and the Poolbeg, which Joyce called the Poolbeg Flasher, behind the other shoulder. And I think the straight lines of the painting, the severe straight lines and right angles of the black frame, they don't quite contain Joyce, because nothing can. He's perched at an angle to all those straight lines, and his art itself can't be contained. It breaks literally out of the artist's framing device, as if it is now part of our reality. And this is a technique I think Robert has used before in a wonderful painting of John B. Keane, who also seems to be stepping out of the painting into our world. Now, of course, it's all a bit anachronistic. Joyce wouldn't have walked on Sandymount Strand at that age, but then he didn't cross O'Connell Bridge with Robert Ballagh, as was depicted in another painting, either. But I think it's interesting that the painting is not of the urbanized space of inner Dublin, which is a place that Robert knows very, very well and has depicted in many, many fine photographs. It is a kind of pastoral setting of Howth, the place in which Leopold and Molly first made love, the place in which Finn camped with the Fianna, and in which the young W.B. Yeats slept under the stars. And the bay, which starts with Joyce here at Sandymount, goes by a vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs, the rivulets of water running between the swerves of the shore. As I said, Joyce has his feet on the ground, but the sands are soft and they are shifting. Robert is in many ways a narrative portraitist, which is a surprising thing in someone who's also a modernist painter. He has often depicted artists surrounded by their props. For instance, Hugh Leonard alongside his typewriter, Bernadette Greevy with her recordings. But here, apart from the cane, Joyce is only furnished with the sheets of his immortal prose, spilling out of the frame, already sheets biodegrading with the little shells which Stephen crunched under his feet as he walked along the sands. And I think the clouds, the water, the man himself are all presented as shape changers, examples of protean flux. And we remember the scene of Stephen on the beach on Bloomsday morning, where he did three things. I always said to students, the three Ps. He peed, he picked his nose, and he wrote a poem. And the question was, which was more important? And the least important, of course, was the poem. And Robert, likewise, is, with Joyce, not allowing us to forget that art is just one way of transforming matter, but there are other ways as well. And Joyce, as a kind of holy fool, and I may be completely wrong in my reading of this, but I'm giving a personal response, it seems to me that there's a kind of Eastern indifference in Joyce to the fate of those sheets, which he's written, but he has cannily put his right foot down on one of them, just to save one, as he lets the others blow away. Joyce, of course, followed the Impressionist painters in seeking to capture a single moment in each day, with all the limits that implies, a man and a civilization at the mercy of a moment. This picture is of Joyce in flux, and it's asymmetrical. One shoulder of Joyce is higher than the other, perhaps indicating a chip on his shoulder. After all, Ezra Pound called Joyce the injustice collector. One leg is crossed and the other is straight. The eyes behind the prescription glasses are of different magnification, and even the sides of the jacket are not quite aligned. It is a Louis Copeland suit, but this is what happens when a boy from Belvedere wears one. You can see that the man, potentially at least, is a dandy, a courtier without a court. But he also looks happy enough to be wearing the Copeland suit. He looks mildly surprised, I think, to be the subject of a suburban pastoral, and so he should be. Just to finish, I think Oscar Wilde once said that every really good portrait is a portrait of the painter as well as of the sitter. Robert and I have been friends for many years. I have always admired not just his work, but his role in Irish public life, his fearlessness, his articulacy, and his openness to counterpoints of view. This is a painting of a man who never stood for the portrait, of course, but I think it celebrates, in a very democratic way, the ordinary man as extraordinary, and an art that is, like all of Robert's, faithful to the actuality of persons and of things, but which, after much arduous and audacious labour, is capable also of mocking itself. There is a beautiful element of self-mockery in the painting, which I can't pin down, but which I deeply feel, and which I think Robert must have intended. What the T shape, the letter T, stands for is anyone's guess. I can't imagine, but I bet you there'll be whole articles written about it in time. I won't debase it with the prior interpretation, but simply say it has been a privilege to see the painting in gestation before its unveiling this week. And I think as a painting, it does what Joyce's art and Robert Ballagh's art have done so well. It captures the random, the mysterious, the inscrutable nature of life. It captures the solitude and the sadness of people brave enough sometimes to stand alone, as Joyce does. It captures the hilarity of human and artistic aspiration. And in the end, it suggests a margin of jaunty hope that allows both the artist and the painting to pull through. So on behalf of the community, I would like to say thank you 1,000 times to Robert Ballagh for this wonderful painting, which is a fitting tribute to one of our greatest artists. And I'm now going to ask him some probably naive and silly questions about it. Thanks. Am I doing all right, Robert?
Excellent, yeah. 10 out of 10.
Well, the ultimate critic. It's not the first time, though, you've done Joyce, is it?
No. Actually, I did a very kind of simple stylistic pop portrait of James Joyce for the old Aer Lingus Hotel in Knightsbridge in London. I was commissioned to do, I think it was a half a dozen portraits of Irish writers, and Joyce was one of them. I remember I got the grand total of £150 for doing the 6 pictures, so it wasn't one of the best paid jobs I ever had. But they remained hanging in that hotel until Aer Lingus actually sold the hotel and it became something else. And I don't know where the pictures went, but I never saw them again. And then later I did a picture for a Dutch publishing company which had the title "In the Heart of the Hibernian Metropolis," which of course is an opening line from one of the chapters in Ulysses. And it was based on a photograph from the Lawrence collection of Sackville Street as it was then, O'Connell Street as it is now, in 1904. the year of the original Bloomsday, and I put James Joyce into it, but of course the James Joyce I put into it was the James Joyce photographed by Giselle Freund in Paris many, many years later. But he's striding down Sackville Street, and just a few yards behind, modestly behind, there's a self-portrait of myself at his shoulder. So that was another occasion of a portrait of Joyce. And then I was commissioned by the central bank to do our old banknotes, and one of the subjects for the banknotes was James Joyce. And that was an interesting one in that the governors of the bank were quite insistent that I should do a portrait of Joyce smiling. Well, I don't know how many of you have studied the archive of images of James Joyce. He doesn't smile a lot, and so I had to invent this smiling Joyce, which I felt was slightly inaccurate. And the other thing they were quite insistent was that you would clearly see his eyes. Well, anyone, again, who studied photographs of James Joyce would know that almost from the time he was in Belvedere, he was suffering from bad eyesight and had trouble with his eyes, and eventually ended up with very thick lenses in his glasses. And so in many ways, that portrait on the £10 note was hugely inaccurate. Funnily enough, Stephen Joyce, his grandson, who can be awkward and difficult, was interviewed when the note came out by one of the papers and said, what did he think of Mr. Ballagh's interpretation of his grandfather? And he replied, well, Mr. Ballagh has his view of my grandfather, I have mine. So I never figured out whether he liked it or not. But it was a joy to get this commission, because at last I felt I had the opportunity to do a portrait of James Joyce as I would personally like to have done. And I'm very grateful to the people in UCD that I was given a complete free hand on this, which led to that great nervousness after having spent the best part of 6 months painting the picture and then inviting them to the studio to see it. And that terrifying moment if they walked in and said, that's not what we wanted at all. Thankfully, that didn't happen. So it now has a home here, and I'm delighted that it has.
Is the painting like what you originally imagined it might be, or does it change a lot in the doing?
It does. Well, I suppose I should say that I trained not as a fine artist, but as an architect. So when I'm planning a picture, I do many sketches on tracing paper, almost like the way an architect would design a building. And I ended up with basically 2 versions of a standing figure of Joyce. I'm glad I didn't do the one I didn't do, because it was, again, I was very interested in hearing you talking about the dandy thing, because I feel very strongly that some of the representations of Joyce are incorrect in terms of his reality. I think that, for instance, the statue on North Earl Street, he kind of looks a bit like a tramp in it. And Joyce was not a tramp, you know. He spent an awful lot of money that Harriet Weaver gave him on buying nice clothes and drinking nice wine, so he was anything but a tramp. In fact, there's a passage in Portrait, towards the end of a portrait of the artist as a young man, where he describes himself, and he said that this is Stephen Dedalus, and he says, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a student, and he goes through a list, and near the end of the list he says, and I'm a hand-me-down dandy. So he saw himself in that light. Elegant. And I was determined to present him in that light. But one of the, and the vaudevillian thing that you picked up on, I think is quite interesting, because one of the poses, oh, by the way, I got a friend of mine, Gerard Keenan, who works with the Irish Chamber Orchestra, to model in my studio, because I figured he was roughly the same size as Joyce, because I didn't want to use poses that people are very familiar with from all the photographs. I wanted something new and different. And I got him to pose. And one of the poses, I don't know if you've ever seen those song and dance fellows, and they flip the cane over their shoulders and hold it like that. And that was one of the images I was toying with right up to the end. And boy, am I glad I didn't do that, because when I looked back on it recently, he looks crucified in it. And I didn't want to be the man who crucified James Joyce. You know?
You were saying about the statue in Earl Street, and I agree with you. But it would be very hard to do a statue of Joyce, wouldn't it? I remember in Exiles, he says, he has one of his characters say, there's only two kinds of statue in Dublin. The one holding out its hand saying, in my day, the dunghill was so high. And the other one that's looking down and saying, for God's sake, how can I get down out of here? There's something monumental in a way about statues that goes against. I mean, there is an element of mockery in the painting, isn't there? I mean, not just of Joyce, but of yourself too. Or am I overinterpreting?
No. Well, certainly one of the quivers in my bow is the quiver of irony. And I find it hard to do anything that isn't tinged with irony. So I don't know if irony is close to mockery, but it certainly would be there, yeah.
And you've done an awful lot by now, of Irish writers. You've done portraits. And this is in a country where many people would see the visual and the verbal artistic traditions almost at odds with or rivals of one another. But clearly, I mean, you can't think that, given all you've done.
No. Well, I mean, I've been painting now for over 40 years, and certainly when I started, the kind of ideology, if I can use that, in the visual arts in Ireland was very much determined by the notion of modernism that developed in Paris in the early part of the 20th century, which is described by the phrase l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, that the only genuine subject for the visual arts should be art itself. And I found that incredibly confining because, you know, not just because of my own personal interests, I've always enjoyed reading, it's been a passion of mine always, but also it seems to me to deny a fundamental aspect of Irish culture, which is storytelling. I mean, it's one of the things that we do so well as a people, and the whole idea of narrative. So, like, I just found it a crazy idea that you could set rules for making paintings that deny this almost essential element in our culture. So right from the word go, I was determined not to be bound by those rules. And, you know, sometimes I painted, you know, figures from the world of literature from my own choice, but a lot of them were also commissions. And I'm fascinated with the business of, you know, the visual image and the printed word. And, I mean, as in this recent portrait, it was essential for me that you could actually read the words from Joyce's writing, that it wasn't you know, an abstract impression of the words. You know, I wanted somebody, if they had the time and they were bothered, to be able to kneel down and actually read the excerpts from Portrait, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. And I've done that. I mean, going right back when I did the portrait of Hugh Leonard, the piece of typewriter, or the piece of paper in the typewriter, actually is a screenplay describing the scene where I'm actually sitting opposite him, sketching him, you know? So I've always enjoyed that interplay between the written word and the visual image.
And how long would it take you to do a painting like this? I mean, you must put it through a lot of different stages.
This particular one would have taken about 6 months. Now, a lot of that was due to the fact that I very foolishly, not from an artistic point of view, but from a practical point of view, one, chose Sandyman Strand, and two, in choosing Sandyman Strand, I wanted to do it with the tide out, and I wanted to do it with those lovely little ripply things in the sand. And I discovered very quickly because I usually paint the backgrounds in first before I do the figure. And I suddenly discovered I'd never done this before, and I found it brutally difficult to paint the sand, and spent, I think, the best part of a month trying to figure out how to paint sand. You know.
And when you're trying to figure that out, would you go and look at what other painters?
Oh yeah. But I couldn't find anyone who painted Sandyman Strand in the National Gallery.
No. Yeah.
But no, I looked at other artists' work. For instance, but he does it much better than me, but there's a famous American artist called Andrew Wyeth, who does beautiful paintings of the side of a stream with kind of pebbly beaches, and I said, that's what I want to do. And when I tried to do it, I couldn't do it.
And why did you give him the dicky bow?
Well, he did wear a dicky bow.
Yes.
I don't think he ever wore a red polka dot dicky bow. But he did. There's no doubt about it, that thing that you realised and picked up on. I did have a kind of feeling about this vaudevillian sort of thing, and thinking back, because I haven't read Ulysses for years, but I have read it many times over the years, and I loved that aspect. I mean, I think Joyce was the first pop artist, because what was pop art except the inclusion of mass media things and, snatches of song titles and all sorts of things. And Joyce loved doing that,
Yes.
I felt very strongly that, the notion of him as a, part-time vaudevillian was an interesting concept.
Well, and also the Seaside Girls.
Yeah. And of course he loved singing Thomas Moore's songs and things like that, Yeah.
I know that in your ideological beliefs you'd be very supportive of the women's movement and feminism, and yet it has happened, as probably for most painters who work to commissions, you've painted a lot more men than women, haven't you? Is that because of the vanity?
I hope that's a critique of Irish society rather than a critique of myself, Yeah. But I will concede that I think I've received in 40 years 2 commissions to paint women, I'm delighted to say that I'm actually working at this present moment in time on a portrait of a very interesting woman. So in about 6 months' time, she will take her place.
If you get a commission to paint someone of whom you do not unconditionally approve, and this must happen from time to time to any painter, can you embody your reservations in the painting, or do you try and control them?
If I totally disapprove of the person, I wouldn't take the commission.
All right.
Or if I found it uninteresting, I got into trouble in the week before Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II came to Ireland, and I was on a debate on the Pat Kenny programme, and somebody texted in or phoned in to say that if Robert Ballagh got a commission to paint the Queen of England, would he do the commission? And unfortunately, I replied far too quickly by saying no. And Kenny asked me why, and I said, well, I don't think she's a terribly interesting woman. And this apparently annoyed an awful lot of people. But being very honest, I don't think she's a terribly interesting woman,
Well, was Paul McCartney said that?
She is very like my late mother in appearance, and I never painted a portrait of my mother,
I'm thinking about that, yeah. The landscape aspect of this painting is interesting too. Like you made a decision, obviously, to have him standing in the south side of Dublin so you could paint the north side. This is, my inner Roddy Doyle coming out. I mean, was this all as deliberate as that?
Well, inevitably, I think it's inevitably an inevitable fact that if you stand on Sandymount Strand and look out to sea, you are viewing the north side.
Yes.
Which happens to be my side as well as your side. But that might be an accident of geography.
But the north side, in a kind of semi-Paul Henry mode, is a new one on me, yeah?
Yeah. Well, it's... I don't know what Howth looked like in, whenever that kind of fictitious setting was. So I just eliminated all buildings, which is probably incorrect. I would imagine the hotel in Sutton was there then, but the only buildings you can see are the Poolbeg Flasher and the Bailey. I mean, obviously there were a sprinkling of other buildings, but I decided to eliminate all buildings.
Maud Gaughan's house would have been up from the Bailey Lighthouse.
Conor Cruise O'Brien's house.
She describes it in A Servant of the Queen funnily enough, as the ugliest house in Ireland, but the one with the most beautiful view.
Yeah.
And Conor Cruise O'Brien bought it eventually. And
is that right? Same house,
yes,
Whitewater.
He extended an extra section in which he kept a very extensive library on modern terrorism. Did you read Joyce when you were pretty young, or
pretty young? Although I have to say, you know, it wasn't that I was a precocious youth, but I don't know if a lot of people do that or not. Well, I grew up actually in Ballsbridge, and I regularly, you know, with pals, went on forays down the Dodder to Ringsend and out to the South Wall. And it's one of the reasons why later I found, for instance, you know, an encounter in Dubliners, you know, so meaningful to me, the boys mitching from school and ending up in Ringsend on the DOS. You know, so that all was relevant later. But I remember when I was a teenager, and before I read Joyce, actually, this sounds embarrassing, on my own, strolling along Sandymount Strand, wondering what to do with my life, you know. So I was kind of walking in Stephen's footsteps before I even realised it, you know.
And I know you did a very interesting project of photographs of Dublin some years. It's a while ago now. What do you think of? I mean, obviously Dublin is famous through literary depictions. What do you think of the way it's been depicted in painting? Do you think it has been captured with anything like the same intensity in visual as in verbal art?
Not in recent years, I don't think. My book of photographs, all those photographs were taken in 1980. And the interesting thing about the city then was it was kind of not entirely unchanged from the city that I grew up in the 1950s, which was certainly unchanged from the city of Joyce and the city of my father. So I think that's one of the reasons why I still personally find, you know, those topographical references in Joyce so nostalgic for me, because he's describing the city that I grew up in, you know, whereas, you know, the city that my children grew up in was utterly changed, you know.
Yeah.
A terrible beauty is born.
Yeah, and I mean, he is very aware of, so much of Ulysses is set in public space, even though it's a book of private, intimate thought. It's actually in constant public settings.
And he was, you know, from you know, information that we've learned from biographies and everything, he was so anxious that his references to shops, to pubs, to everything, he was determined that they would be accurate. So he, I know he wrote to his aunt, and anyone who arrived from Dublin and Paris was quizzed about where such and such a shop was on such and such a street. And he made that famous statement that if Dublin disappeared, it could be rebuilt from his books, you know?
Yeah, I think it would be hard to do, though.
You couldn't do it now.
No. And actually, he, like in most epics, he assumes your knowledge of a lot of the settings rather than actually describing them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I'm sure there are people with lots of interesting questions that you might like to put to Robert about this painting in particular or his work in general. So I should perhaps open the discussion now to the House for further debate. There's a man down here, yeah.
Yeah, Declan said about the as far as he was concerned, the jury was out as to why it was a T and what that meant. Perhaps some people might be happier if it was an L shape, like people put on their cars when they're learning to drive, you know. But the T shape came about for very practical reasons, not dissimilar reasons for the choosing of a cruciform shape for the portrait I did of Noel Brown, which hangs in the National Gallery. And the funny thing, when the Noel Brown portrait was first exhibited, it was actually exhibited in Edinburgh, at an exhibition of Irish art in Edinburgh. And some critic wrote a headline saying, "Robert Ballagh has crucified Noel Brown." which wasn't my intention at all. And when I was doing that picture, one of the things I felt very strongly that I wanted to get across, and you have referred to this, was this breaching of the space between the art and the viewer. And the device I chose in the Noel Brown picture was, he was standing on a stony beach in Connemara, and the stones literally tumble out of the painted surface and kind of change into real stones in your space as a viewer. Now, philosophically, that's an easy thing to do. What I discovered, technically, the difficult thing to do was to paint stones in the picture that were so realistic that you couldn't tell the difference between them and the real stones. Now, this was technically possible, but it was tortuously slow to do. So as I was doing this, and I should say, by the way, that I had decided, for whatever reason, to make this picture on a modular basis. In other words, it was a series of squares that were joined together to create a big rectangular picture. And I spent about a month and a half doing 2 squares of stones behind Noel Brown's legs. And I said, I can't go on with this. This is driving me bloody well mad. So I suddenly realized that I could take away 4 of the squares, 2 on each side, and the picture worked perfectly without them. So they disappeared. And then I looked at it, and there was a fairly plain blue sky up above, and his head went up in the middle, but the 2 ones at the top, I didn't need those either, so we'll get rid of those. And I stood back and I looked at this thing and went, oh my God, what have we got here?
The Son of God.
Yeah, the Son of God, yeah. But so, I mean, I've never been able to live down the belief that I deliberately decided to paint Noel Brown in a crucifix format or a cruciform format. But it actually came about for a very practical reason. With the portrait of James Joyce, I've right from the start, once I decided that he was going to be standing on Sandyman Strand, I've very strongly felt that the figure should be it should be a full height figure, so that there's a strong verticality to that, and that there would be a landscape behind him which has a very strong horizontality. So, you know, when you get that shape and that shape, you're left with a T. Also, it spared me about 3 months painting sand.
Are there any other queries, or comments, questions?
I've two things to say. One is a question and the other is an observation. When you said you were working on a portrait of a very interesting lady, it crossed my mind to ask, is this a painting or is it a biography in the mature Joyce style? Secondly, I think you said that Joyce was very fond of fine wine and of fine clothes, and therefore he couldn't have been a tramp. Now, I know many a person addicted to fine clothes, but also addicted to fine wine, and is very much a tramp.
Well, the answer to the first question is that this is a portrait, a painting that I'm working on at the moment, a commissioned portrait of someone that I think you probably all know, but I'm honor bound not to mention at this stage who it is. But when it comes out, you'll all know who it is, I hope. The interesting thing, and I'm not an expert on Joyce in this regard, but I think I heard the other night where you spoke at that book launch about Joyce, there was mention of the fact that over a period, Harriet Weaver gave James Joyce the equivalent of £1 million.
Probably more.
Probably more. So he wasn't necessarily short of a few bob to buy Louis Copeland suits.
Well, he believed, like the ancient Gaelic bards, that artists were worthy of serious remuneration.
I believe that too, but I haven't had any luck in that regard.
What? just a quick point. What do you think when you see paintings you did in your impecunious youth being sold for vast sums of money?
Well, I used to be very grumpy.
Yeah.
But since I took the Irish government to the High Court and forced them to implement droit de suite or resale rights for artists, I'm less grumpy because I get 4% of the resale price now.
Well,
better than all artists do, not just me.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
Firstly, I'd like to say, Robert, that congratulations on the painting. I think it's wonderful. The question I have is regarding the location. You mentioned personal reasons, going on jaunts to Ringsend and Sandymount Strand and things like that. Did you ever toy with the idea of perhaps placing the portrait in Zurich or Trieste or Paris, or was it always bound for Dublin? Of course, given the fact that it was going to be destined for University College Dublin.
Well, I've never been in Zurich. I drove through Trieste once in a bus, but I didn't get off, and I know Dublin, I think, very well at this stage, having lived in it for 68 years. So I think by default it was going to be Dublin. And I do have a strong affection for that part of Dublin, even though I'm a North Sider now. But even though I'm a North Sider, almost every week or every second week, I drive the car over to the South Wall and walk down to the Poolbeg and back again. And I used to do it years ago with my father and my children, and it's a very important place in Dublin for me, and I think it was kind of important for James Joyce as well, or else he wouldn't have written so extensively about it.
No, that's true.
I like in one of the pages, if you look at it, it has that wonderful passage about the ineluctable
modality of the visible.
The ineluctable modality of the visible, and the final line, our second final line on that page is, "I must be walking to eternity on Sandymount Strand." So I think Joyce had an affection for the place as well.
Yeah.
There's this Magritte-like moment at the bottom of one of the sheets of paper, crossing the frame and being about to be released into our world. Would you like to say something more about that? Is that something you particularly relate to Joyce, or would you do that in other paintings as well?
Yeah, it's a thing I kind of probably do too often, actually, but I must think for a second before I try to express myself. I believe that, the arts, the visual arts, are a means of an artist communicating his or her ideas to not just an art audience, not just to art critics, but to the general public. So consequently, I'm passionate about bridging gaps, or bridging resistance that is placed in that attempt to bridge that gap between the work of art and the public. And one of the things I've done in many, many works over the years is to incorporate some device that literally almost leaps from the picture plane out into your space as an observer. For instance, I spoke in some detail about the pebbles spilling out of the portrait of Noel Brown into your space as the visitor to the gallery. You mentioned the J.B. Keane, who is literally stepping out of the frame of the picture into your space. Michael Farrell, who was a great friend of mine, I did a posthumous portrait of Michael, and he's sitting at a bar, which was, where you mostly could find him, and but the bar is actually three-dimensional, and there's a pint on the bar that is three-dimensional that you literally, as the observer, feel you could pick it up and take it away yourself. So it's been a constant theme in my work to try and include something in the picture that will bridge that gap between you, the observer, and the work of art itself. I think the kind of philosophical phrase for that would be a de-alienating device.
Mm. Mm. Yes?
Not having the subject with you for sitting, what's that like for the artist, for not having the dynamic of the presence of the subject? What do you have to fill in yourself in their absence? What's that like for you?
Well, to be honest, I prefer not having the subject there. I find the subject usually finds the process quite embarrassing, and certainly I find it quite embarrassing. So apart from doing a few sketches and things like that, I would largely, I would take hundreds of photographs of the sitter. What is important, like I have in the past, I mean, well, Joyce would be a case in point, I suppose, in that he's dead, so I can't take his photograph. But usually, if I'm doing a portrait, I like to take the photographs of the sitter myself. Not so much that I take better photographs than somebody else, but it's all about getting to know the person, and people are more comfortable having their photograph taken than being painted, I can assure you. There was a program on the television the other night. Now, mind you, they were all sitting there in the nude being painted, which I'd imagine...
Was this John Waters in the nude?
John Waters, yeah. The hairy John Waters. Yeah.
I was actually... You have painted yourself in the nip on quite a few occasions. Yeah. Were you tempted to do this to Joyce?
Well, I didn't have sufficient information.
Yeah, you didn't interview Nora Barnacle.
Yeah. Joyce does describe the private parts of Leopold Bloom, yes, but he neglects to give us a description of his own private parts. So there was no question of portraying Mr. Joyce in the nude.
Yes, there's one more question maybe. Yep.
Bobby, congratulations on the painting. I think it's a very fine work. I'd like to comment or ask you a question which really relates to your career and especially your identification with left-wing causes over many years. It's now approximately 25 years since the assassination of the Iraqi painter Laila Al-Attar, whom you knew and whose death you protested along with artists in different parts of the world. What are your thoughts on that event now, some 25, 26 years later, bearing in mind that you're in a university which commemorates President Clinton in an auditorium?
Yeah, this is not a trick question.
No. President Clinton was not guilty of her death. It was Daddy Bush. It was during, what do they call it? Operation Desert Storm was the military attack on Iraq. You're right. I was in Iraq in 1986. There was a UNESCO conference there, and I was invited to speak at the conference. And by the way, back then, Iraq was a great friend of Ireland. We sold them all their beef. We ran their hospitals. We sent out doctors and nurses there. And at the time, we apparently considered Saddam Hussein a great friend of Ireland. I went out at that stage and I visited that Iraqi artist's studio. We were brought around to see various places. And she was an eminent artist in Iraq. And it was just part of the trip. I remember when I came home, one of the papers asked me to write an article about my experience there. And I have to say that the Iraqi Artists Union were extraordinarily generous and helpful, and I was very complimentary about what they did for us and everything. It was a big international group of people who had been there. But one of the things that disturbed me greatly was the nature of the regime. I mean, I found it odd that we landed in the Saddam Hussein International Airport and drove into Baghdad on the Saddam Hussein International Boulevard and crossed the Saddam Hussein Memorial Bridge and went to the conference in the Saddam Hussein Conference Center, and every street corner had a mural of Saddam Hussein kissing babies or shooting his enemies. And at the time, the Iraq-Iran war was on. And when I came back, I wrote this article, which was quite praiseworthy of my Iraqi colleagues, but I did enter a caveat in terms of the regime. I was very concerned about the nature of the regime. And I was vociferously attacked, particularly by members of the Fianna Fáil party, who said that this was one of the best regimes in the Middle East and they were friends of Ireland and how dare I attack them. If you fast forward to 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the Americans decided to invade Iraq, and I was asked to become a patron of the anti-war movement, and the same people who criticized me, it was in '86, for attacking Saddam Hussein, now accuse me of being a stooge for Saddam Hussein. So, but this is a rambling way of explaining the context for this. But one of the most terrifying things I saw was when, and it was the first time that phrase shock and awe was invented, when the United States bombed Baghdad. And I remember watching it on the TV that night and seeing cruise missiles hitting places that I was in when I was there a few years before. And one of the cruise missiles hit that artist's home and studio and vaporized her studio, her home, herself, and her family. And I just thought this, I mean, she had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein's regime or anything like that. And this was at the time when we were being told about intelligent bombs and things like this. So I was kind of appalled. I wrote a letter of protest to the US Embassy. I signed letters of protest to the papers, and nobody cared, you know. So it's one of the disappointing things that happen in life.
Well, Robert, you've covered a great deal here. Thank you so much for all your art, for the way in which you have, in some ways, captured the essence of this city, whose Lord Mayor is with us, Jerry Breen, and thank you for being here. And also, I know that the period in which you completed this painting was a time of great difficulty and sadness in your own life and for your family. And to me, the depth of that feeling is part of the greatness of your painting. Nothing is ever completely lost. Thank you so much for everything you've contributed and will continue to give us in years to come. Robert Ballagh.
Lord Mayor, President, distinguished guests, in echoing Declan's closing remarks and thanks, I'm mindful that as you leave O'Reilly Hall today, you're all going to stop and admire the portrait and look at all of the details that have been referenced in this conversation. Can I say that we deliberately hung the Ballagh Joyce at the entrance to O'Reilly Hall, because this is our conferment hall, and all graduates or all students as they come to graduate will pass the painting, and it will reference one of our most famous alumnus, as we've already said. But also this is our largest public space, and this is the venue in which many visitors to the university will also be able to view the portrait. So Robert, can I say on behalf of the university, we are delighted with the rendition of Joyce, very delighted with the commission, and thank you for that. Can I thank you for attending the event today? It has been a real pleasure to get the insight and from the horse's mouth, so to speak, your thoughts on this painting. And Professor Declan Kiberd, can I thank you also? It's a pleasure always to listen to you talk and present the painting, and can I wish you both all the very best for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have enjoyed this event this afternoon, UCD Alumni Relations ran a series called Characters in Conversation. Our next series will be launched in September, and you can view the details on our website at that time. It's now my pleasure to thank you for attending this afternoon, and to say thank you and goodbye and safe home.